None of this constitutes any challenge to the predictive and explanatory power of evolutionary theory. With regard to intelligent design, there is simply no theory or anything approaching it. It is not used in scientific research, even by its primary proponents. All intelligent design is a series of failed and rejected criticisms of evolutionary theory. Easily, the biggest challenge facing the intelligent design community is to develop a full-fledged theory of biological design. We don't have such a theory right now, and that's the real problem. Without a theory, it is very hard to know where to direct your research focus. Right now, we've got a big, we have a big bag of powerful intuitions and a handful of notions, such as irreducible complexity and specified complexity, but as yet, no general theory of biological design. Do you agree or disagree with that statement?
No. If someone had read that statement to Copernicus, we never would have gotten to a heliocentric view of the world.
And if Copernicus would have been held back by the then dogmatic view of those that controlled the faith, we would still believe the earth was the center of the universe, wouldn't we, sir?
No, my point was that even the kind of science that Copernicus used had to start somewhere. And one could have very well said, using the conventional wisdom of Copernicus, to say, hey, there's no research program here. This isn't anything worth taking seriously. I mean, every effort to develop some kind of science has to start somewhere.
Is it also your opinion, sir, that is it also your opinion, sir, that it is important to have religion taught in economics?
Oh, for sure.
Mathematics?
That's a harder case, but you can actually make a case for that. I'll be happy to do it if you'd like.
Are you familiar with the Clergy Letter Project?
No.
I have in my hand an open letter concerning religion and science, which as of May 3rd, 2005, had 3,352 signatures collected to date. And it reads as follows. Within the community of Christian believers, there are areas of dispute and disagreement, including the proper way to interpret Holy Scripture. While virtually all Christians take the Bible seriously and hold it to be authoritative in matters of faith and practice, the overwhelming majority do not read the Bible literally, as they would a science textbook. Many of the beloved stories found in the Bible, the creation, Adam and Eve, Noah and the ark, convey timeless truths about God, human beings, and the proper relationship between Creator and creation, expressed in the only capable of transmitting these truths from generation to generation. Religious truth is of a different order from scientific truth. Its purpose is not to convey information, but to transform hearts. We, the undersigned Christian clergy, from many different traditions, believe that the timeless truths of the Bible and the discoveries of modern science may comfortably coexist. We believe that the theory of evolution is a fundamental scientific truth, one that has stood up to rigorous scrutiny and upon which much of human knowledge and achievement rest. To reject this truth is to treat it as one theory among others, is to deliberately embrace scientific ignorance and transmit such ignorance to our children. We believe that among God's good gifts are human minds capable of critical thought, and that the failure to fully employ this gift is a rejection of the will of our Creator. To argue that God's loving plan of salvation for humanity precludes the full employment of the God-given faculty of reason is to attempt to limit God, an act of hubris. We urge school board members to preserve the integrity of science curriculum by affirming the teaching of the theory of evolution as a core component of human knowledge. We ask that science remain science and that religion remain religion. Two very different but complementary forms of truth. You disagree with that?
I agree with some of it and disagree with some of it, and I'd be happy to comment on it.
In human history, can you think of any particular aspect where the combining of, the combination of faith with science has created detrimental problems for humanity?
Innumerable times.
And do you think that perhaps the one lesson that history has taught us is that it is important to keep science neutral so that no individual faith in any particular nation determines what is or is not appropriate science?
Absolutely not.
Do you believe, therefore, that it is the Christian faith that should determine what specific intelligent design might have been involved in the universe?
Absolutely not.
So you would not limit it just to the Christian faith?
Of course not. Of course not. My whole comments were that education has to be neutral among religions as well as between religion and non-religion, that it should be liberal, which means including all of the major ways in which humankind has developed to understand the world, and that it should be politically just in the sense of not disenfranchising huge numbers of American citizens. And that is not exclusive. That is inclusive. And of course evolution should be taught in schools. Of course it should be taught as neo-Darwinian evolution. It should be taught as the dominant view of scientists, but it shouldn't be the only view. That leads to all kinds of problems simply with regard to whether or not students are in a position to assess whether neo-Darwinism is a reasonable position.
Are you familiar with the National Science Teachers Association?
I know what they are.
What they are?
Yeah, I know what it is. I mean, I don't know what you're asking, what I should be familiar with.
Do you disagree with their concept of keeping science neutral? Or is it your opinion that because science involves itself with the study of natural phenomenon, that in essence makes science a religion?
No. Science, again, Professor Manouche did a marvelous job of explaining that neo-Darwinism isn't the same thing as atheism. Of course it isn't, because one can believe that there are other things going on in the world. But when you teach only neo-Darwinism, the inevitable conclusion to draw is that does explain everything. Design theory does not require a God, I don't believe. It certainly doesn't require the Christian God.
Kansas doesn't teach neo-Darwinism. What are you talking about?
Certainly
Kansas does not teach.
No, of course the majority report, unless the majority report specifically says we don't mean to teach neo-Darwinism, the inevitable conclusion of any reasonable human being is that you teach the dominant view of scientists, the one that's written into all the textbooks, into the national science standards, and all the other documents, and that's neo-Darwinism.
And could it be, perhaps, that the reason that all major national and international science organizations believe in the theory of evolution is because the overwhelming majority of all scientific research suggests that it is the truth?
No.
No further questions.
Dr. Nord.
Yes.
When you're talking about religious groups, I'd like to go back and explore that just a little bit more. There's obviously all forms of religion. There's theistic religion, Christian, Jewish and Muslim, as well as non-theistic religions. What are you saying when you say incorporate religious groups into how you were defining that?
There are problems. The problems stem from the fact that there are many, many different religious groups and religious traditions. So the question is, what in the world can it mean to be constitutionally neutral among them? Or if liberal education requires a kind of inclusivity of points of view, how many points of view do you have to include? That's, of course, a problem that educators face all the time. Which points of view get into the textbook? Which historical events and movements? Generally, it's done in terms of influence. What are the influential views? So there has to be a kind of winnowing process whereby we decide how many points of view can we take seriously, and the more points of view we take seriously, the less time we have devoted to them, so the more superficial the understanding of the students will be, and we try and find some kind of a happy medium, so that we say in studying economics or in studying history or in studying whatever field, we certainly need to introduce students to the ways in which several important religious traditions have understood what's at issue. I am not saying that every course, economics, science, history, whatever, should become a course in theology or moral theology and philosophy. All I'm saying is that within each of those courses there must be a kind of introduction in which the discipline, the conventional wisdom of that field is put into a larger context and related to various philosophical and religious concerns and questions. And maybe at certain key points of deep controversy, such as evolution or the Big Bang, or relationships of the first world to the third world, or poverty, then these kinds of moral and religious questions and concerns should resurface in the text, and it should be pointed out to students that what they're learning is deeply controversial.
I'm just trying to clarify this. I don't mean to belabor the point. But are you suggesting that, for instance, with the concept of origins, that the idea of the Christian origins and Jewish origins and Muslim and Wiccan and Native American and so forth would be briefly described? Is that what you're suggesting?
Yes. I think an introductory textbook that deals with the Big Bang, for example, cosmological evolution or biological evolution, there should be an introductory chapter in which modern scientific views are put into the context of this old historical and ongoing historical discussion about design and nature, about the relationship of God to nature, so that students see that what they're learning is part of this larger ongoing historical and philosophical conversation that has been so tremendously important in Western civilization, indeed in Eastern civilization too, but in somewhat different ways. It's not to convert the science course or the economics course into a course in moral theology, but it's to show them that there are alternative ways of making sense of the subject matter and to locate them in that discussion so that bridges are built so that education becomes a conversation rather than, as I said, serial socialization, being more or less indoctrinated into one view in an economics course, another view in science courses, another view in history courses, and so on.
Would that make it exceptionally difficult for the teacher?
It would make it... It would make it very difficult for the teacher. And there needs to be much consciousness raising, there needs to be much better resources. Teacher education is utterly tone deaf to this problem, and so there needs to be much improvement in teacher education. A tremendous amount needs to be done, but let's be clear about what the ideal is and what we should be working toward.
To switch topics just momentarily. You defined a liberal education as something that is exploring all viewpoints of a particular topic. Is that
how? Well, let's say all the major viewpoints on the most important issues, because there's only so much you can do.
Okay.
A liberal education is usually viewed as the opposite of a narrow or a parochial education. That's an education where you simply get kids to think one way about the world. A liberal education, liberal comes from liberty. There's a long tradition of the idea that students should be introduced to various ways of thinking about the world. We take that so far in saying they should be introduced to various disciplines, but we don't include religious or philosophical ways of thinking about the world among those disciplines in public schools, and we make no effort to relate the disciplines to each other to see where they complement each other, where they conflict with each other, what the tensions are. That leaves them uneducated.
I have been, my impression, my understanding of what a liberal education was something that had a broad range of topics, the arts as well as the academics, the reading, writing, and so forth, as well as physical education, mental education, fine arts. Is that just the tip of it, as I understand you're saying?
Yes. I mean, I think that's the most common view. Let's introduce students to a number of subjects. The problem is subjects can be interpreted in various ways. We don't introduce them to subjects nearly so much as we introduce them to disciplines, particular ways of making sense of the world. As I said, the Council for Economic Education, which wrote the National Economic Standards, said students should only learn to think about economics in terms of neoclassical economic theory, even though hardly anybody except economists think that way. That's a deeply illiberal kind of education. So saying students need to study economics to be liberally educated, but then saying all they need to understand is neoclassical economic theory, is to undercut the whole idea of liberal education. It should be to introduce them to various ways of interpreting each of the subjects that we deal with in the curriculum.
Well, you said earlier that it should be free of constraints in a specific discipline. Would you talk about that?
I don't know what I might have meant if I said that. Free of constraints.
That's what I was trying to... I didn't fully understand it when you were talking.
No, I think the curricular conversation should, to some considerable extent, mirror the larger cultural conversation. That is to say, the purpose of a liberal education isn't simply to initiate students into the way PhD economists understand the world or PhD scientists understand the world. It should be to initiate them into a larger cultural conversation. A lot of the voices in our cultural conversation are left out of the curricular conversation. That leaves students unable to understand the culture they graduate into. So to a considerably greater extent than we now do, the curricular conversation should make students aware of and understand the larger cultural conversation and not be so narrowly disciplinarily focused.
Thank you, Dr. Nord.
Thank you.
Mr. Calvert.
I'd like to introduce to the committee my next witness, Mustafa Akolo. Mr. Akolo is a columnist in a Turkish daily newspaper, freelance writer in the U.S. media, and Director of International Relations at the Intercultural Dialogue Platform headquartered in Istanbul, Turkey. Mr. Akol, thank you very much for coming so far to testify today. And I would, could you give us a little bit on your background?
Thanks for having me again in Kansas, and I deeply appreciate the state of Kansas for inviting me to give this testimony, which I hope will be a contribution to this very important debate here. As you said, I'm a writer. I'm a political science graduate from the Bosphorus University, which is an American university in Istanbul. I had my master's in the history department there, but since 1997, I've been working as an independent writer, columnist in Turkish press, and I have been also working with some Muslim organizations who are interested in the debate between intelligent design and Darwinism. And that's why I read the literature of the debate thoroughly, and I have a great, I can say, understanding of what's going on here. And over the years, I've attended debates on national TV. I have given seminars in many universities in the United Kingdom, in Turkey, about these issues. And I believe that intelligent design theory is a scientifically valid understanding of origins. When I was informed about the debate, I just read the minority report, and I also took a look at the majority report, which is available on the website. And I think I completely agree with the minority report that you're presenting.
Could you talk a little bit about your involvement in the intelligent design issue? Go into that in a little bit more depth.
Okay. Actually, to go into that a bit, maybe I could give a few more personal background too. When I was a child, I loved watching documentaries in Turkish TV about nature, about animals, about plants, and actually these were American or European-made films which dubbed in Turkish, and I loved watching them. And I had a great grandfather that I loved, and he was a pious Muslim. And he said to me one day, well, watch these films, they're very good, they're beautiful, but be careful. These films always talk about the wonders of nature. They never talk about who made those wonders. They never talk about the creator of the natures. So that was a message that I found important. And my grandfather didn't like, and I asked my grandfather, why don't they talk about the creator of those wonders in nature? And he said, well, the Westerners are people who are blind to the reality that there's a God. They are completely materialistic. Western civilization is like that. Be careful about it. And I said, here's a point that I should be careful about. But later on, in the 1970s, I just, by reading and writing and just searching the internet, I discovered that there are some people in the West, especially in the United States, some scientists who don't have that approach, who don't have that materialist bias my grandfather told me about, but who are objectively looking into nature, and they are tracing the evidence of design, which you cannot see if you have a materialist bias. So then I just, at the same time, I met an organization in Turkey, Science Research Foundation. They were interested in these issues, and I joined them. And I never became an executive or an official part of an organization, but I just, first I learned and written about this, and I engaged in debates, and in 1998 we started to give seminars in Turkey. And in one instance, I remember that in a Turkish university, I was quoting Michael Behe in one of my speeches. And there were some very conservative Muslims there. I mean, I'm a Muslim, but they were ultra-conservative, I could say. One of them at the end asked, well, you quoted American scientists. Why? Well, I said, and I said, well, what is strange for you in that? What do you find it weird? And he said, well, aren't they all of them materialistic? I said, no, as you well see, some of them are not. And I just sensed that, that started to change his perception about America. And actually, that is one of the reasons I find very important. Why I'm here, I should explain that. I'm coming from 6,000 miles away. I live in Istanbul. And why a debate on the science standards of state of Kansas is interesting for me. Well, it is very interesting. It's very important for me because I think this is an issue which will have implications beyond Kansas, beyond even the United States. It will have an impact in the minds of the people, and it will create a sense of what America is in the minds of people. And I could say in recent years, I can claim to be an expert on Islamic radicalism. That's what I write, especially in the United States, in the media, and in Turkey. We know that we have this big problem of Islamic radicalism, a widespread hatred of America and the West in general in the Islamic world. And it has many reasons, sociological reasons. It has some about the failure of the Muslim world in the 20th century. But one reason of the widespread resentment is that Muslims think that the West, and also, of course, the United States, is completely a materialistic civilization. They think that when they watch Western films, when they watch when they read the Western media, and when their kids take the Western education, they think that they will be poisoned by an ideology, materialism, and that's why they just don't like it. They just want to get away from it. And at the very extreme, it creates what we have anti-American sentiment among Muslim populations. And I remember that, for example, but when people get a sense of the U.S., and when they see that it's not like that, it's not completely materialistic, they might think differently. And again, in my childhood, I remember that one of the most popular TV series in the 1980s was The Little House on the Prairie. Muslim conservative families all loved it, and they said, "Oh, look at these American values, and they're so noble values," and they just admired it. And now times have changed. Now they see MTV, they see the Hollywood, and I mean that's of course materialism in a cultural sense. I mean materialism in terms of hedonism and just caring about profit and don't having any ethical values. But materialism also has a philosophical side, and that philosophy is, as we all know, it's also called naturalism, the idea that nature is all there is. And when that philosophy, which has no scientific justification at all, becomes the dominant force in science education in the United States, what you have is that you will have alienated people. You will have, for example, Muslims. They will feel alienated. They will think that there is a school system which imposes on them, on their kids, a philosophy which they don't believe and which they find to be poisonous and which doesn't have any scientific evidence at all. That's the important point. I mean, materialism could be very bad, but it could be scientifically true. Then you should have to come to terms with it. You could say, well, if it is a fact, maybe we can adopt some of our beliefs. Well, that's not the case. It doesn't have any scientific evidence. I mean, we have been listening to the experts here in the last 3 days. I mean, when you look at all the fossil record, the Cambrian explosion, when you look at the irreducible complexity in the cell, it is clear that blind chance and natural law cannot create the complexity of life. It's very evident. And while it's very evident, if you insist that no, we will never ever allow anything besides this in our textbooks, in our culture, in our country, then people will think that, oh, this is a nation under materialism. Now, and also, I should say that I'm not just the only Muslim here thinking like this. We have 2 guests. I have called my 2 friends from Kansas. Can you please show your hands? Yes, these my friends are living in the Kansas state, in the Kansas area. They are here to support the Minority Report today. And there are many Muslims out there who think like them. And as I said, this is not just about Kansas. This is about a whole civilizational issue. And I don't mean that science education should be changed in order to win the hearts and minds of Muslims. No. It should be saved from bias. It should be saved from dogmatic materialism. It should be just objective. I mean, there are Muslim theocracies in the world which wouldn't let any materialistic theory, for example, in Iran and Saudi Arabia, you can't probably learn about Darwinian evolution, and I find that terribly wrong. What is true, what is needed is just a science education which doesn't try to indoctrinate children with any philosophy. That is necessary for science education, and it is also necessary for just getting rid of some stereotypes, getting some misconceptions about the United States.
Mr. Akyol, are you familiar with the way evolution is taught in Turkey? And as I understand it, Turkey is a secular Islamic country. Is that correct?
Yes, it's a secular republic. I mean, most of the people in Turkey are Muslims, but the state doesn't have any Islamic identity. It's completely secular.
And how did the Turkish schools, public schools, teach origin science?
They don't have as much focus as you would have here you can find in the Kansas standards, but there is a fair approach. The school curriculum talks about the theory of evolution, Darwinism and Lamarckism, and it says, well, there's an other view held by some scientists that life was designed. So there's you could say, fair approach.
Do they teach criticisms of evolution? And essentially teach both sides of the evolution controversy?
You can say that. I mean, since they acknowledge that there's another theory held by some scientists, and according to some scientific evidence, and there's also mentioning of the abrupt appearance of some species and the lack of transitional forms between different taxa. They mention that. I mean, I could say that there's more emphasis on Darwinism, but it's also say that there's an alternative understanding and it has its scientific evidence, and they also mention that scientific evidence as well.
Do you think the Minority Report would, how do you characterize the Minority Report in the context that you were seeking an objective approach?
I would describe the Minority Report as a very sophisticated, intelligent attempt to save the education standards from materialist indoctrination and to give it a fair and objective understanding of science.
Thank you. Is there anything else you'd like to mention?
Well, yeah, a few points. Maybe a few preemptive answers of the Council. Well, the belief in the scientific establishment, I mean, Mr. Council just said that major scientific organizations in the United States accept the neo-Darwinian theory, and just he insisted on that. That's a fact. But what we should care about is not the opinions of scientists, but the scientific evidence on the ground. Because scientists, yes, sometimes become misled. If you were just living a century ago, we would find that most of the major established scientific institutions, most prestigious scientists, would be believing that some races are inferior. Racism was very much popular at the turn of the century. And also you can find eugenics was preached among scientists. So scientific opinion might be shifted, because scientists are people, scientists are humans, and they're affected by the cultural trends in society. So they might go wrong. And what we have to do is just to follow the evidence, not what necessarily a group of scientists claim. And also there's the fact that we have scientists who criticize Darwin evolution too. I mean, do we have to just close our eyes to their arguments, to their books, to their sophisticated arguments, their compelling evidence? It's true that there's a scientific controversy, and the controversy should be taught. Otherwise, I would say it will be bad for the education standards of Kansas. But besides that, it will be bad for the understanding between people, especially of the Islamic world and the United States. I assure you, what we debate here will be on the news in Turkey in a few days. When you have a decision, it will be all in the news in Turkey, in the Arab world, in many countries. People are watching this very closely, and they know that the people who argue for the Minority Report here are not saying, well, we are against evolution because it is against our beliefs. No, they know that there is scientific evidence for it. It's clear. I told that scientific evidence to thousands of Muslims in Turkey. They know it well on TV So, if the outcome is biased in terms of bias for materialism, I think that will feed the misconception about the United States that it is a completely materialistic nation.
Thank you very much. Mr. Ganagari, your witness.
Mr. Garnagarai, you have 8 minutes.
Sir, I have a few questions for the record that I need to ask you.
Sure.
What is your personal opinion as to what the age of the Earth is?
4.6 billion years.
Do you have a belief in the general principle of common descent, which is that all life is biologically related back to the beginning of life? Do you agree with that statement?
I agree with limited common descent, but I don't believe in universal common descent because I don't see any scientific evidence for it, compelling evidence.
Do you accept that human beings are related by common descent to pre-hominid ancestors, yes or no?
I'm skeptical about that claim because I don't see any compelling evidence that there's a lineage between pre-hominids and humans.
You've mentioned ID theory. Would you please tell us precisely what ID theory is?
Intelligent design theory is a scientific theory which argues that life on Earth can be explained as a result of natural laws, chance, and intelligence. So it's a theory which argues that intelligence can be detected in nature, and yes, and it is being detected. And it's also a theory which disagrees with the neo-Darwinian theory, which argues that life on Earth is the product of chance and laws.
Would you please point to the standard in Kansas that expresses the philosophy of naturalism?
The term naturalism doesn't appear in the science standards, as you mentioned many times, but it is implicit there, and especially in the phrase which defines science as the way to explore, the way to explain nature as just by natural forces. I think it's very obvious there.
So by attempting to understand the world in which we live in through a better understanding of nature, it is your opinion that that represents naturalism, which is an atheistic practice?
Can you repeat the question?
Absolutely. Is it your position that by studying science, looking for natural answers to the processes around us, that those who follow that path are atheistic?
Definitely no. I think that science should look for natural causes, but if there is compelling evidence that something in nature is not the product of natural causes, if there's an evidence that there's an intelligence cause was at work, science should not be blind to that, and it should be able to infer design there.
You said compelling evidence, correct?
Yes.
I'm somewhat concerned about some of the comments you made about how we are perceived in the Muslim world. America has historically taken the path that religion and government should be separated. Are you familiar with
the First Amendment?
No, I appreciate you advancing my question, but no, that's not where I was going. Are you familiar, sir, and let me find my note. I had made some notes that I'm having a bit of a hard time finding. Give me just 1 second.
You're welcome.
Well, I'm going to have to go off the cuff, as we say here. I read with great interest a book not long ago by Professor Bernard Lewis. Are you familiar with Professor Lewis?
Yes, I know him well.
And the book that I read was What Went Wrong. Are you familiar with that book?
Yeah, I have that book and I've read it.
You've read the book. Well, then perhaps this will be an easier conversation. You will recall that Professor Bernard Lewis had a conclusion to what he perceives to be the present problem that is creating difficulties in the Muslim world. Do you recall that?
He points to several problems, but I wonder
And
which
do
one.
you remember what he concluded as the solution to the problem in the Muslim world as far as his understanding?
Modernization, that's generally what he argues for.
No, I think you're wrong, sir. My recollection of Dr. Lewis's conclusion was that, unfortunately, the Muslim world, somewhere in the point of the last millennium, decided that it was going to abandon its quest for broader knowledge and to become involved more with the concept of the inclusion of religion in every aspect of the Muslim world. And it was Dr. Lewis' proposition, was it not, that the cure to the problem was to follow the American model, that is the separation of church and state.
Yes.
You do recall
yeah,
that.
I recall that. And I agree with that.
And you agree with that?
Yes. But the problem I see here is that the American principle of separation of church and state is being violated by the materialist indoctrination. When you define religion just as theistic religions, you just missed the picture. Religion includes materialistic, atheistic philosophies, and I just want a fair separation of church and state.
So your suggestion is that when scientists attempt to the best of their ability to find answers within nature without a supernatural imposition, that is in fact a religious practice?
No, that's a very rational and good practice that I acknowledge. And the problem, I think, starts when, despite that effort, they see the evidence for an intelligent cause, and when they deny it, start to deny it, the problem starts there. Otherwise, yes, you should explain nature in terms of natural causes. But what if there is an intelligent cause that you are blind to?
Do you believe that just because somebody suggests a hypothesis, that it deserves serious attention? Or would you rather suggest that for us to teach a hypothesis in science, it should be based on solid research, the scientific process, and a clear understanding of what we're going to be presenting to our children?
You're very right, it should be, and that's why the minority report doesn't ask for the inclusion of ID theory in the curriculum right now, which is being developed, but it just asks for the evidence against Darwinism to be mentioned, which is out there, but which the curriculum doesn't want to see currently.
Thank you.
I thank you.
Mr. Akol, am I saying that correctly?
Akil.
Akil.
Thank you, anyway.
You're saying, did I understand you to say that the public perception in Turkey is that they have an understanding and that they know that these hearings are going on about the discussion of science standards in Kansas? Is that what I understand you to say? Do I further understand you to say that they are aware that this is about trying to achieve the best science standards free of religious and philosophical problems that the best we can achieve? Is that
yes, I think that's a good description of the perception in Turkey, I would say. Of course, not every person on the street knows about the debate, but it's been in the newspapers, and it will be more in the newspaper when there's a decision about this.
In Kansas, the perception generally is that we're trying to insert religion into the science standards. And that is categorically not what I am trying to do. And I just find that I'm a little bit amazed that the media in Kansas doesn't seem to be able to portray that, and yet the media in Turkey is able to get that perception across. I just wanted to make sure that I understood what you were saying.
Well, there's a phrase I like. A Chinese professor said, in China you can't criticize the government, but you can criticize Darwin. In the U.S., you can criticize the government, but you cannot criticize Darwin. So the same thing might be for Turkey too. Although, I mean, America's liberty and, of course, diversity appreciated, but I think there is a problem in the some of the mainstream media in the United States. They're extremely biased about this subject. So I think that, of course, Turkish media is very diverse too, but there's a general sense that what is being done here is, I mean, the Minority Report. They don't know the term Minority Report, but the attempt here is to save the textbooks from a religion which is materialism.
Thank you, Mr. Akul.
I thank you.
We're going to break now, and we will reconvene at 2:45. Are you ready?
Yes.
Mr. Calvert, please proceed.
Okay. I'd like to present my next witness, Dr. Michael Behe, who is I believe, a professor of biochemistry at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania. Dr. Behe, would you please give us a bit on your background?
Yes, I received a bachelor's of science degree in chemistry from Drexel University in 1974. I then went on to the University of Pennsylvania, where I received a National Research Service Award predoctoral fellowship and received my PhD in 1978 with a dissertation on sickle cell hemoglobin. I then did a postdoctoral work at the National Institutes of Health, where I was a Jane Coffin Childs fellow there on my research concerned nucleic acid structure. My first position was at Queens College in New York City, where I was an assistant professor in the chemistry department, and continued my work on nucleic acid structure and nucleic acid protein interactions. In 1985, I moved to Lehigh University, where I'm currently a professor in the biology department.
I believe you're also the author of a book that was published in 1996 called Darwin's Black Box. And my understanding is that that book posed a question or a challenge to natural selection to explain what you refer to as irreducibly complex systems. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. The argument of the book is that what science has discovered in the cell in the past 50 years is poorly explained by a gradual up theory such as Darwin's. And if you look at it, the evidence suggests that, in fact, many systems in the cell show signs of purposeful, intelligent design.
Your claim of irreducible complexity, or your argument of irreducible complexity, and I guess the argument is that there has yet to be shown to you or to science a detailed explanation of how natural selection can assemble such a system. And in your book, I believe you make various different arguments against it. Since it was published in 1996, there have been a number of scientists that have criticized the theory. Could you comment briefly on the criticism and the current status of the debate about that in the scientific community?
Yes, the book from the beginning was very controversial, and from its inception, some scientists, particularly Darwinian biologists, offered arguments against it. And I have responded to their arguments in a number of book chapters, a number of articles in philosophy of science journals. Briefly, I argue that their counter-arguments are themselves mistaken. And I think they don't really get to the heart of the argument. And so I think my theory has stood up.
Is it fair to say that the scientific community is still wrestling with that claim, and there has yet to be a scientific consensus or as to an outcome on that? Is that?
Well, it's true that some people still make arguments against it, and some papers in the literature seem to be written with this concern in mind. So yes, I think it's safe to say that certainly some members of the scientific community are still wrestling with the concept.
Do we have the PowerPoint fixed?
No.
While we fiddle with the PowerPoint, why don't we, I'm going to direct your attention. Do you have another copy of this?
Was the problem that my first slide was blank? Was that it? Okay.
Dr. Behe, while he fiddled with the we're going to talk about page 15 and 16 of the minority report. There we go. Okay, well, you have those 2 pages on your slide. And I've asked you to comment particularly in your talk today about the proposed change that appears on page 16, which would introduce students to this concept, whether macroevolution can be extrapolated to explain whether microevolution can be extrapolated to explain macroevolutionary changes such as new complex organs or body plans and new biochemical systems which appear irreducibly complex is controversial. Would you agree with that statement?
Yes, I would. I certainly think it's correct.
Would you also agree with the next sentence that these kinds of macroevolutionary explanations generally are not based on direct observations and often reflect historical narratives based on inferences from indirect or circumstantial evidence?
Yes, I think that's correct as well.
Is this something that you think students should be made aware of in a complete understanding of biological evolution?
Yes, I think so.
Would you please go ahead and I believe you have a presentation that addresses a specific issue, and I ask you to proceed with that.
Sure. I'd like to start by saying that it's not just myself, not even just ID people, intelligent design people, but a number of scientists have been skeptical that microevolutionary processes, Darwinian processes, can explain larger patterns in biology and especially in the molecular biology of the cell. For example, Stuart Kaufman, who's a professor at the University of Calgary right now, wrote in a book in 1993 that it is not that Darwin is wrong, but that he got hold of only part of the truth. For Darwin's answer to the sources of the order we see all around us is overwhelmingly an appeal to a singular force, natural selection. It is this single force view which I believe to be inadequate, for it fails to notice, fails to stress, fails to incorporate the possibility that simple and complex systems exhibit order spontaneously. And this was published by Oxford University Press, an academic publishing house. Why are some scientists skeptical that Darwinian processes can account for what they see, especially at the molecular level of life? Because in the past 50 years, science has discovered, much to their surprise and which was completely unknown in the time of Darwin, that the cell, the basis of life, is composed of machines, literally machines made out of molecules. This illustration up here is a cover from the journal Cell, which was published in 1998, a special review issue on the topic of molecular machines. And you see in the lower left-hand corner a kind of a stopwatch to suggest the sorts of machines that people have found in the cell. And inside, on the table of contents, there are listed a number of articles, such as the cell as a collection of protein machines, polymerases and the replosome, machines within machines, mechanical devices of the spliceosome, motors, clocks, springs, and things. And the editor of this special issue was a man named Bruce Alberts, who is the president of the National Academy of Sciences. And in his introduction, he states, "We have always underestimated cells. Undoubtedly, we still do today. But at least we are no longer as naive as we were when I was a graduate student in the 1960s. The chemistry that makes life possible is much more elaborate and sophisticated than anything we students had ever considered. Indeed, the entire cell can be viewed as a factory that contains an elaborate network of interlocking assembly lines, each of which is composed of a set of large protein machines." Now, why is this a difficulty for Darwin's theory? Well, because in 1959, in his seminal book on the origin of species, Darwin saw a weakness or a difficulty for his theory. He wrote that if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous, successive, slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down, adding, "but I can find out no such case." Here he was insisting that his was a gradual theory. Natural selection had to improve things slowly, in many steps, over a long period of time. He knew that if things improved too quickly, it would look like something other than random processes were involved. Well, what sort of a system can't be explained or is very difficult to explain by numerous successive slight modifications? One which is irreducibly complex or has the property of irreducible complexity. This is a fancy phrase. It just means that you've got a system with a number of different components that interact with each other to produce a function beyond the system or beyond the components itself. And an example I cited in my book, Darwin's Black Box, on this from our everyday life is a mousetrap. A mousetrap has a number of different components, such as a spring, holding bar, catch, and so on. And it needs all these components to work. If you take away the catch, if you take away the spring, if you take away the holding bar, it's not that it works half as well as it used to. It's broken. It doesn't work at all. Now, things like this are a problem for a gradual theory like Darwin's because the function of an irreducibly complex system only appears essentially when the system is complete. In intermediate stages, there's nothing for natural selection to select. And after it's finished, there's not a whole lot for natural selection to do. So things like this are challenges to Darwin's theory of gradual evolution. So are there any such irreducibly complex systems in the cell? And I argue that there are many of them. Yes, they're all over the place. For example, here's a molecular machine called the bacterial flagellum. And I guess I should add that most machines that we know of are irreducibly complex, and the cell is chock full of molecular machines, like this one. This is the bacterial flagellum. It is quite literally an outboard motor that bacteria use to swim. It's got a number of different components, like a propeller, which actually pushes against the water and pushes the bacterium forward as the rotor spins. There's a hook region, which acts as a universal joint to attach the propeller to the drive shaft. The drive shaft is attached to the rotor, which uses a flow of acid from the outside to the inside of the cell. There's parts that act as a stator to keep it clamped onto the cell membrane, just like an outboard motor has to be clamped onto a boat as the propeller turns. And there are many other components as well. Now, let's see, where am I? I made this argument in my book, Darwin's Black Box, in 1996, and since then, the book itself has been pretty widely reviewed. For example, the New York Times, Nature, a prominent science journal, Philosophy of Science, the Philosophy Journal, Quarterly Review of Biology, and so on. What have other scientists had to say about my claim that these things so far are unexplained by Darwinian processes? Well, they've had a lot of things to say. Richard Restak, writing for Brainwork, liked the book. Just let me say that right up front. James Shreve, a science writer, writes in the New York Times that Mr. Behe may be right that given our current state of knowledge, good old Darwinian evolution cannot explain the origin of blood clotting or cellular transport. A man named James Shapiro, who's a professor of microbiology at the University of Chicago, wrote, "There are no detailed Darwinian accounts for the evolution of any fundamental biochemical or cellular system, only a variety of wishful speculations." Jerry Coyne, who's a professor of evolutionary biology at Nature, wrote, "There is no doubt that the pathways described by Behe are dauntingly complex, and their evolution will be hard to unravel. We may forever be unable to envisage the first proto-pathways." Andrew Pomenkowski, a British scientist, writes in New Scientist, "Pick up any biochemistry textbook and you will find perhaps 2 or 3 references to evolution. Turn to one of these and you will be lucky to find anything other than, quote, evolution selects the fittest molecules for their biological function," close quote. So the point is that many reviewers of my book have agreed that these complex molecular machines so far are unexplained within a Darwinian framework. But some scientists claim that such explanations are out there somewhere. And a man named David Griffin, who's a professor of the philosophy of religion at Claremont College in California, nonetheless wanted to track down those explanations. And in his book, Religion and Scientific Naturalism, he said that the response I have received from repeating Behe's claim about the evolutionary literature, which simply brings out the point being made implicitly by many others, such as Crick, Denton, and so on, is that I obviously have not read the right books. There are, I am assured, evolutionists who have described how the transitions in question could have occurred. And he continues, "When I ask in which books I can find these discussions, however, I either get no answer or else some titles that, upon examination, do not, in fact, contain the promised accounts. That such accounts exist seems to be something that is widely known, but I have yet to encounter anyone who knows where they exist." And I think the most succinct summary of many reviewers of my book is contained in a book called The Way of the Cell, written by a man named Franklin Harold, who's an emeritus professor of biochemistry at Colorado State University, which was published by Oxford University Press a couple years ago. And Franklin Harold wrote the following. He said, "We should reject, as a matter of principle,